Hi guys, this is Anthony here, and I just want to say welcome to this video, firstly. Secondly, this video is the orientation for the Network Automation mini course, the Practical Network Automation mini course. And in this orientation video, I'd like to take you on a high-level overview of all the different things that we will be covering and what we won't be covering. So here's our agenda. We will first cover some of the things that you want to make sure that you read up on, and that falls under the principles of a successful system. And as you may recall, the principles of a successful system was a series of emails, with the exception of this one, that are on the email list. So for those who are not enrollees watching this video, if you are interested in any of these topics, then get on the email list. We will be covering robustness a little later, probably the next couple weeks, but just be sure that you read these. These are important pieces to understand because these are the type of principles that we will be applying to this system when we create it. Next, what I want to cover is the different components that will be tying in to our network automation system. The first one is the modeler. And the modeler will essentially build out a workflow of what our network automation system will look like from end to end. It will cover every possible outcome, whether that be positive or whether that be negative. Second thing we're going to cover is our source of truth, which will be using Flask, a very simple Flask app. And we'll have a couple of services hosted in that Flask app to where we can access data to use to tie into our automation workflow. Obviously, you guys know that the programming language we'll be using is Python. We had a debate over this of which would be preferred. Would you want Ansible or Python? And the most interest came from Python. The next thing is we will be using Postman. So technically you can make API testing work in Python, but for those who are newer to Python, it's better to use something like Postman. Postman has a user interface. It's more GUI based. It's much easier to work with, and it's very well laid out. So for the sake of our testing with the API we're going to be making, we're going to be using Postman. And then finally, we are going to be doing some very basic source control with Git, just so you have a very high-level understanding of that. We are going to model the service, and some of the questions we have to ask ourselves when we create the service is, firstly, what are the steps in the process? What are all the positive outcomes? What are all the negative outcomes? And what are the additional details that will be necessary to ensure a seamless end-to-end workflow? So you think of the positive outcomes. What is our possible positive outcome? One of those could be connecting to the device. That's a positive outcome. Not being able to connect to the device is a negative outcome. So that's a very basic example. We're going to get a lot more into detail when we get to the course though. The additional details that will be necessary, that has to do with data that the device may not be able to provide us directly. And that's where other external components may tie in and become beneficial to the automation process. The other thing is we will be building out APIs in Flask. As I mentioned, there will be two services within this single API that we'll be building. The first one is the device inventory. This will be used to keep track of things like device information. This can include the hardware, this can include the software. This is where we can determine what is the network OS. And then we will have a second piece, which is the config standard. And the config standard will provide us a standard for various different config requirements, and we take that and we use that to create a template, a desirable config, and then we compare that to the device's config. So there's going to be some other components that we have to tie into this using Python. One of them is a config parser. For the sake of what we're going to be doing, it's not going to be a simple line-by-line comparison, because there's going to be some places where you have things that are in a parent-child format. So for example, if you're looking at the VTY line configuration, you're going to have things under there that have to be connected to the VTY line configuration. So like if you need to have only SSH enabled, that's going to be more than a single line comparison. Like I said before, you're going to want a desirable config using the compliance check, and that desirable config, part of that will come from the config standard API. Another part of that will come from some template generation. The compliance report will give us everything that a device is not compliant on, and it will give it in a format that we can use to our benefit. Finally, we want to make sure that all of the multiple components that are going to be used in this Python project are tied together in a sequentially desirable fashion. Now finally, there's one last thing I want to cover here, and that is what will not be covered. Now I will say right now, before I proceed, that this course is going to be a set period of time, and I expect to have questions at the end. If there is extra time at the end, then I am totally okay with covering some of these things if there's interest. Testing is one thing that is not planned to be covered. Testing is important when it comes to developing code, but as a network engineer, the main thing that the network engineer wants to get to first is trying to get the solution to work. Although testing is important when we're talking about production level program. Same goes for linting. Same also goes for CI/CD. These three things are very important when it comes to production ready related stuff. I'm not going to cover Docker because we already covered Docker in one of the previous YouTube videos. Eventually I may have another video on Docker, but for our particular use case, we will not need Docker at all. Linting is, again, not covered, but we can cover it if we have time. Linting has to do with making sure the Python code is up to standard per PEP 8, as well as looking for YAML that is not in the correct format, because we use YAML files. The next thing is the virtual device deployer, which some of you may have seen. I have a script that runs, deploys a topology to EVE-NG, loads the configurations, and it pretty much does all the provisioning for me. I don't have to do any of that. As long as I have a config, and as long as I know how many devices I want, it'll pretty much deploy all that for me. Finally, the CI/CD. So there's three different CI tools that are very popular, commonly used. I'm not going to go into depth in the course unless there's time, like I said before. So the three CI tools are Jenkins, GitLab CI, and Travis CI. Now, for the case of the repository that I'm using for this course, we are going to be using Travis CI, simply because Travis CI works seamlessly with GitHub, and you don't need to install a VM or a container for Jenkins, because you have to have again, an external dependency, and we don't want that. We want to make sure everything is in one place. And I want to go back here to the API content for a second, because I almost forgot to mention this is our replacement for Netbox. If you noticed from a couple previous videos ago, we were using Netbox to gather device information. But I thought about it and I was like, well, you know, most of the individuals that are going to be doing this probably don't know how to deploy that. They don't know Docker well enough, or, you know, whatever it may be. So what I did instead is I just made an API to access that same data locally. So you don't need to install Netbox. Pretty nice, right? Okay. And for those enrollees, I will see you soon. But before we go, firstly, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, subscribe, share with your friends, share with your peers, whoever it may be. I wanted to cover a couple other things. One of them was the repo. If you haven't checked out the repo yet and you are an enrollee, I highly recommend you check this out. This is where all the code is going to be stored. I already have a good majority of components populated in here of what we're going to be covering. As you can see, there's a few other things here that you may not be familiar with. We're not going to cover all this. Some of this is more so just to make sure the project moves along smoothly. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is on my site, on the Smooth Automation site, there are a couple of books here. And I recommend you check, if you can, check out this book right here. This is all about building microservices. And this is really, microservices are the way of a lot of very big companies. And it's how they create these huge systems, such as Netflix, for example. This book is really, really fantastic when it comes to building out a optimal system. And you know, I tie this in here because this is really what we want to create. We want to create a successful system, a system that is robust, a system that is efficient, and a system that is maintainable. Okay? So that's all I have for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk again soon.